I plunged into the mud, slid close to the edge of the ravine, and clenched the red flare in my hand. Behind me, a Bigfoot was charging through the forest. Every step made the ground tremble beneath my chest. When I turned back, I saw it standing in the rain, 9 feet tall, its shoulders as wide as a barn door. It only looked at me, then glanced toward the valley behind it. In that moment, I understood it was not chasing me because it was hungry. Hello, I'm Victor, and you're listening to a story on Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories. Today's story takes us back to the fall of 1978, on a remote stretch of the Appalachian Trail, where an experienced hiker claimed he was attacked by a giant Bigfoot. Our editorial team collected this story from forums, blogs, oral accounts, old records, and Bigfoot research communities. Still, we cannot verify whether this is the truth, a distorted memory, or a local legend. Listen with an open mind. If you believe the deep woods still hold secrets, comment Bigfoot, or share a strange experience you've had out in nature. And now everything begins with a decision that seemed ordinary. In the fall of 1978, Daniel Harper, 34 years old, began a multi-day hike along a section of the Appalachian Trail running through the Blue Ridge Mountains. As a former soldier with survival experience, Daniel entered the forest carefully prepared, believing every phenomenon could be explained by reason. That belief gradually began to shake when he discovered giant footprints, trees twisted and broken at unnatural heights, and tree knocks that seemed to be carrying signals across the ridgelines. After ignoring the warning of Walter Briggs, a man who studied Bigfoot legends, Daniel met a young couple named Mark and Susan Ellis. Mark's pride pushed the group deeper into the forested zone they had been warned about. When Mark chased a dark shape to take a photograph, a massive Bigfoot appeared and attacked. Daniel used a flare, loud noise, and military experience to draw the creature away from the other two. The chase led him to a hidden valley, where many adult Bigfoot and young ones were living. Daniel realized the creature was not hunting humans. It was protecting its family and territory. His survival ultimately depended on lowering his weapon, respecting the boundary, and choosing to retreat. Before we begin, leave a comment with the name of the city or place where you live. I want to know how large our Bigfoot community really is. In late September of 1978, Daniel Harper drove his old Ford F-100 into Damascus, Virginia, while early mist still lay thin over the low rooftops and distant mountainsides. He parked behind a small motel, pulled his backpack down from the truck bed, and set it on a wooden bench near the entrance to the Appalachian Trail. Daniel checked every item in the familiar order: a one-person tent, a cold-weather sleeping bag, a paper map, a compass, a first aid kit, rope, dried food, an aluminum pot, 2 flares, and a handgun for emergencies. The shopkeeper from the outdoor store across the road came over, looked at the bulging pack, and joked that Daniel was preparing for the whole winter. Daniel smiled, tightened the shoulder straps, and answered that a few extra pounds usually caused back pain, while one missing item could sometimes cost a man his whole return trip. That made the man stop laughing and nod, as if he had just realized Daniel had been through more than his calm appearance showed. Near the notice board, a young man was fumbling with a compass he had dropped on the ground. Daniel bent down, picked it up, placed it away from the metal buckle on the man's belt, and showed him how to keep the needle steady. He spoke slowly, without sounding preachy, then returned to his own pack. His years in the military had left Daniel with the habit of observing before acting, but this trip had nothing to do with orders or proving himself. He wanted a few weeks alone to recover the rhythm of thought that machines, work, and social conversation so often interrupted. Before stepping into the forest, Daniel stopped in front of the warning board about black bears, flash floods, and falling trees. Beneath the official notices, a line written in pencil, blurred by rain, appeared on a crookedly pinned scrap of paper. "Do not camp north of Laurel Gap, Daniel." read it once, looked around the parking lot, and assumed it was a local prank meant for outsiders. He folded his map, shouldered his pack, and stepped onto the leaf-damp trail. As the town disappeared behind the mist, 3 dry knocks echoed from the deep forest. Daniel stopped, listened to the darkness between the trunks, then continued walking, though his steps were slower than before. Behind him, the trailhead had sunk into fog, while that sound still seemed to hang between the trees, steady and intentional. The first 2 days on the trail passed peacefully enough for Daniel to believe the trip was going exactly as he had planned. He kept an even pace, stopped to rest on schedule, checked the map whenever the terrain shifted, and always chose a place to camp before the light drained from the mountain slopes. On the morning of the 3rd day, while following a small creek branch covered in wet oak leaves, Daniel saw a cluster of young trees bent into an arch. Their tops had been woven together above head height, creating a shape too neat to be dismissed as the result of wind. He set down his pack, checked each base, and looked for rope marks, knife cuts, or boot prints nearby. The bark was intact, and the ground held no sign of campers. The structure stood nearly 30 yards from the trail and did not point toward water, shelter, or any lookout. Daniel marked the location in his notebook, then kept moving with a quiet curiosity following behind him. About an hour later, he stopped beside a muddy patch near the creek and saw 3 large footprints pressed deep into the wet ground. Each print was nearly half again, as long as his boot, the heel sunk deep with 5 toes spreading in a fan shape. Daniel knelt, took the small ruler from his map pocket, and measured the length and spacing between the steps. He looked for claw marks like those usually seen in bear tracks, but the mud edges showed only rounded curves like human toes. The distance between the prints forced Daniel to stand and try matching the stride. An adult man would have had to run or leap to make that stride, while the mud around it showed no slipping or hand support. He took out his film camera, shot 2 pictures from 2 angles, and carefully advanced the film. Just as the small gears in the camera stopped turning, a branch cracked on the high slope across from him. Daniel lifted his head and called out, announcing that someone was down by the creek. The only answer was water moving over stone. A dark mass suddenly slipped behind a tree about 80 yards away. Daniel only glimpsed broad shoulders and a strip of back higher than the surrounding brush before the shape vanished. He stood still for several seconds, hand close to his gun, but leaving the weapon in its holster. Daniel wrote down the time, movement direction, and estimated distance in his notebook. When he left the muddy patch, he found 3 horizontal, claw-like marks on a nearby tree trunk nearly 8 feet above the ground, as if a sign had been placed there before he ever arrived, waiting for him to notice. On the morning of the 4th day, Daniel realized the forest was changing, in a way he could not easily explain. Since leaving camp, he had crossed slopes covered in yellow leaves, places where there should have been squirrels running along branches or birds calling to each other between the oaks. But the closer he came to the forest leading toward Whitetop Mountain, the fewer familiar sounds remained. Cold wind moved through the trunks, carrying the smell of damp soil and pine resin, while the air around him held a silence that made Daniel stop again and again to listen. Near noon, he no longer heard insects around fallen logs and saw no fresh deer tracks in the mud. A less experienced person might have thought the weather was forcing animals into shelter. But Daniel had lived for weeks in forests and knew nature was rarely completely silent. As he continued walking, a heavy sound appeared on the slope to his right. Each time his boots pressed into the wet leaves, the sound above shifted, parallel to him at a steady distance. Daniel quickened his pace for several dozen steps, then slowed down. Whatever was moving above changed rhythm almost at once. He stopped suddenly beside a large oak, and the sound of crushed leaves stopped half a beat later. Daniel stepped about 15 yards off the trail, chose a hidden position behind a trunk and waited patiently. Nearly 10 minutes passed, and the forest kept its suspicious calm. Then a small stone rolled down from the slope above, passed over 2 roots, and stopped right beside the toe of his boot. Daniel looked down at the angle and realized the stone could hardly have left its original place without being pushed. He drew his gun from the holster, kept the barrel pointed at the ground, and called out that he was only passing through and was not looking for trouble. His voice moved through the trunks and returned as short echoes. A powerful knock suddenly sounded ahead. 2 seconds later, a second knock answered from behind him. A third came from the opposite slope, forming 3 points around the place where Daniel stood. He felt the muscles in his shoulders tighten, but his mind still worked through old habits. Daniel marked the position on his map, left the area, and walked nearly 2 more miles even though the light had begun to fade. He chose a clearing with broad visibility, tied small metal cups to a warning line around the tent, then placed his gun and a flare within reach. Night came slowly, bringing cold down from the mountains. For hours the cups remained still. Near dawn, Daniel woke to a deep, heavy breath right beside the tent fabric, so close that the canvas trembled with each rhythm. On the afternoon of the 5th day, rain began to fall when Daniel saw an old wooden shelter under the trees near Laurel Creek. Smoke drifted from the porch, letting him know someone was already inside. A man in his 60s sat beside a small, quiet fire, his wet socks drying on a branch set across 2 stones. He wore a faded yellow raincoat, muddy boots, and kept a long lens camera beside his pack. The man introduced himself as Walter Briggs and invited Daniel to sit near the fire. Walter's eyes stopped on the mud on Daniel's knees and the ruler hanging outside his map pocket. He asked what Daniel had knelt down to measure on the trail. Daniel replied that he had seen a few strange signs, but not enough to conclude anything. Walter nodded, said the southern footprints appeared after rain, then asked whether Daniel had heard tree knocks, footsteps that stopped when he did, and the silence of the birds. Daniel looked at the man longer, because he had not mentioned any of those details. Walter took a map from his pack covered with red dots stretching along the Blue Ridge. Each dot matched a disappearance, accident, or hiker returning in panic between 1951 and 1977. Walter did not claim every case was connected to a creature. He said the repeated details were too specific to dismiss as coincidence, from rocks thrown at night to the smell of wet fur mixed with rotting earth. Daniel asked what kind of animal Walter was looking for. Walter replied that he was tracking a behavioral pattern, because a creature could vanish, but the way it protected territory left the same signs behind. Walter pointed to Laurel Gap and advised Daniel to take the western loop instead. When Daniel asked why Walter was still here, Walter went silent, then took out a photograph of 2 young men standing beside a truck. The younger one was Thomas, Walter's brother, who had disappeared near Laurel Gap in 1961. Since then, Walter had spent 17 years piecing together accounts, maps, and tracks, hoping to understand what had happened. He believed the creature in the area gave warnings first through knocks, deliberately placed stones, and blocked paths. Disaster happened when humans mistook those warnings for a challenge. Daniel respected Walter's preparation, but still believed grief could make a person see patterns in places where none existed. Before Daniel left the shelter, Walter looked straight at him and said that if 3 stones appeared in front of his sleeping place, he needed to turn back. When Daniel stepped into the rain, Walter called after him that knocks from 3 directions were a general warning, while one direction alone meant they had chosen who had to leave. Though Walter's warning kept repeating in his mind, Daniel continued on the route he had chosen. The afternoon rain turned the trail into a strip of mud between slippery oak roots. Daniel had to stop early on high ground near Laurel Gap. He reminded himself that bad weather often made the mind stitch separate sounds into a clear threat in the darkness around it. He checked the area around camp, hung his food bag away from the tent, stretched the warning line, and attached the small metal cups. Around 11 that night, a powerful knock sounded ahead. The second came from the left, and the third echoed from behind the tent. The spacing between them was even, like a repeated signal chain. Daniel sat up, placed the gun beside his thigh, and held a flare in the other hand. Something heavy began moving around the camp. The cups remained silent, showing that whatever it was understood the boundary of the line or was stepping outside it. Daniel looked through the tent flap, but the rain revealed only black trunks and waterlogged ground. A small rock struck the tree beside the tent. A second fell closer to the entrance. The third landed right before the canvas, making a compact, heavy sound. Daniel understood that someone wanted him to pay attention to that position. He stayed still, listening to each sound of leaves being pressed down. A while later, the side of the tent dented inward from outside, as if a large fingertip were testing the tension of the fabric. Daniel raised the gun, and the pressure immediately disappeared. The rest of the night passed through long stretches of silence, broken by rain, striking the tent roof. When gray dawn appeared, Daniel unzipped the door, very slowly. 3 fist-sized stones lay in a straight row before the exit. They had not been there when he set up camp. Behind the row of stones was a giant footprint filled with rainwater, located inside the warning line. The cups remained where they had been, and not one had been knocked out of place. Daniel knelt to inspect, then circled the ground. He found no clear series of tracks approaching, only a single print before the tent and several large roots covered in fresh mud. On a tree about 20 feet away, the bark had been stripped from a height of nearly 9 feet, revealing 3 parallel vertical lines. For the first time, Daniel seriously considered turning back. However, when he retraced the old route, a small landslide during the night had buried the narrow southern passage under soil and rock. The longer loop would require at least 2 days and more food than he had planned. The shortest remaining path led straight through Laurel Gap. Daniel returned to camp, packed each item, and tightened the pack straps. At that moment, a single knock rang out from the forest ahead. No answer followed. Daniel stood still, remembering Walter's words and understanding that whatever was watching had chosen him as the person who needed to leave. Daniel met Mark and Susan Ellis at a leaning signpost near the turnoff leading into Laurel Gap. The two stood beside the trail, trying to tie a torn strap on Susan's blue backpack. Mark was about 29, with rain-wet brown hair and a 35mm camera always hanging from his neck. Susan was a few years younger than her husband, her face tired but her eyes alert. Mark looked relieved to see Daniel, because they had not seen another hiker for nearly 2 days. He explained that they were taking an anniversary trip and wanted to reach the northern viewpoint before the weekend ended. Daniel looked at the small folded tourist map in Mark's hand and asked whether they had a topographic map, backup compass, and enough food. Mark answered that the trail was clearly marked, while Susan admitted they were moving slower than planned and had only about 2 days of food left. Daniel suggested they turn back along the southern side route, even though it would add nearly 2 days to the trip. Mark immediately objected, saying the weather would clear and they had come too far to quit halfway. When Daniel asked whether they had heard tree knocks or seen large footprints around camp, Mark laughed and said hunters or woodcutters in the area could make sounds like that. Susan stayed silent longer than necessary. After a few seconds, she said that the previous night something had walked around their tent. It had ignored the food bag hanging from a tree, but her handkerchief disappeared from a low branch and appeared nearly 40 yards from camp the next morning. Daniel turned to Mark and understood that he had intentionally hidden that detail to avoid changing their route. Mark explained that wind or a small animal might have carried the handkerchief away, but Susan reminded him that it had been placed neatly on a rock. Daniel advised them to come with him to the old shelter ahead, where they could rest, check the weather, and decide on a safer route. Susan agreed immediately, while Mark accepted reluctantly because Daniel clearly had better maps and more experience. As the three prepared to leave, Daniel looked over Susan's shoulder and saw a white handkerchief caught on a branch nearly 10 feet high behind them. The fabric shifted lightly in the wind, in a place none of them could have hung it without a ladder. That height was beyond the reach of any adult standing on the slick ground. The three moved in formation, Daniel leading, Susan in the middle, and Mark at the rear. The trail followed a narrow mountainside with mossy rock wall on the left and a forested drop into a deep valley on the right. Daniel told them to keep enough distance to see one another and stay close to the trail. Mark kept stopping to photograph broken trees, strange mud marks, and dark patches of forest beyond sight. Each time he slowed down, Daniel had to turn and remind everyone to keep moving, because light was draining quickly from the mountainside. After they had gone nearly a mile, a low knock sounded from the valley below. Mark immediately pulled out his hunting knife and struck the wooden handle 3 times against a nearby tree. Daniel turned, stepped over, and snatched the knife from his hand. A few seconds later, a heavy knock answered from the upper slope, close enough that Susan lifted her head to watch a pine branch tremble. Daniel said they did not know what rules the thing communicating out there followed, so every answering signal could be understood as a challenge. Mark said Daniel was overreacting, but his voice had lost its joking tone. The knocks continued, moving parallel to the group. One sound appeared ahead, another answered from behind, keeping them in the middle like people being guided through a narrow passage. Susan found 2 freshly broken branches arranged in an X across the trail. The sap still shone at the breaks, proving the sign had been made recently. Mark stepped over it and said another hiker could have used it as a marker. Daniel bent down to check the ground and saw only wide impressions around the brush, not boot prints. He moved the group onto a lower side path. 10 minutes later, they found a larger X made from 2 branches so thick that Susan had to help Daniel pull them aside to open the way. Mark began losing patience. He said this was a public trail system and no animal had the right to stop people from passing through. Daniel replied that the ink lines on a map only showed human choices, while the forest had existed long before signs were posted. Mark sped up, trying to move to the front. A large rock flew across the trail, slammed into a tree in front of him, and fell to the ground. Daniel looked toward where the rock had come from and saw a wide black hand pull quickly behind a pine trunk. Immediately afterward, a deep roar rolled down the mountainside. Mark stepped back beside Daniel, the camera on his chest knocking against his jacket zipper with each sharp breath. The three reached the old shelter when the afternoon had turned a dull gray. The structure nestled under the mountainside, but part of its roof had collapsed. Thick boards had been ripped from the frame and flung across the ground. Daniel set down his pack, walked around the structure, and studied the broken wood ends. The fractures were fresh, the grain torn sideways, as if a powerful force had pulled them free from the metal fasteners. Mark stepped in first, lightly kicked an empty food can, and said a falling tree had probably wrecked the shelter. Daniel looked up at the sky above and saw that the surrounding trunks were still standing. Inside, a torn pair of shoes, several old food wrappers, and a faded raincoat lay scattered on the floor. Susan found a trail register notebook trapped under a plank. Many pages had blurred from water, but the final readable line said, "Something is on the eastern slope. It won't let us sleep." The next sentence stopped halfway, the pen stroke dragging down to the edge of the paper, while the writer's name had been washed away. Mark held the notebook, read it again, and said an inexperienced group might have panicked because of a bear. Daniel moved to the rear post and found a muddy handprint across the board. The palm was wider than his, the fingers long and evenly spaced, the highest part nearly at Daniel's shoulder when he stood upright. Outside the shelter, several drag marks ran into the forest and disappeared in the thick leaves. Daniel bent down to examine them and realized they looked more like the marks of something heavy being moved than someone being dragged. He decided the group had to leave before dark because the shelter had only one exit and the other 3 sides were closed by slopes and brush. Daniel suggested walking 2 more miles to a rocky clearing with broad visibility. Mark objected, saying Susan was tired and continuing through the rain would put them in more danger. Susan agreed with Daniel, and irritation showed clearly on her husband's face. Mark said Daniel was turning every track into a mysterious creature. Susan replied that Mark had hidden the handkerchief and the footsteps around their tent because he was afraid the trip would be canceled. The argument stopped when something heavy landed on the roof. A log nearly 5 feet long rolled over the porch edge and struck the exact spot where Mark had just been standing. Daniel pulled him back and looked up the slope. That log had come from a clearing higher than the shelter, where the wind could not have made enough force to push it. All 3 immediately shouldered their packs and left. When they reached the first bend, Susan looked back. On the collapsed portion of the roof, a giant human-like shadow stood in the rain, its broad shoulders deliberately rising beyond the outline of the trees behind it. The 3 reached the rocky clearing after the last light had drained from the mountainside. Daniel chose a position with a low wall behind it and open ground in front, enough to watch movement around camp. He told Mark and Susan to keep their gear close, make little noise, and avoid a large fire because strong light would make it harder for their eyes to see through the darkness outside. Mark still kept the camera on his chest, checking the roll of film and wiping moisture from the lens. He said he had seen the creature standing on the shelter roof, and the photograph he took might answer the question of this place. Susan looked at her husband and asked why he still wanted to push ahead after seeing something strong enough to throw a log across a roof. Mark said a chance like that might not come again. Daniel set the aluminum pot on a rock and said a photograph was worth nothing if the person holding the camera could not bring it back. While they ate cold food, a strong odor moved across the rocky clearing. It smelled like wet animal fur mixed with rotting earth, so thick Susan had to pull her collar over her nose. The wind was still, but the smell came in waves, as if the source was moving around them. From the forest across from them, 2 amber lights appeared between tree trunks, nearly 2 feet higher than Daniel's head. He raised his flashlight and aimed the beam there, but the eyes vanished before the light touched them. Mark attached the flash unit to his camera. Daniel told him to put the equipment in his pack. Mark agreed quietly, but still placed the camera beside his knee so he could reach it quickly. The night deepened and heavy footsteps circled the clearing. After each round, a short hiss sounded on the left, followed by a higher sound answering from farther away. Daniel recognized that the second voice belonged to a smaller individual. The thought that they were near a family made him watch Mark more closely. Near midnight, a large shadow stepped out between 2 trees. Mark snatched up the camera and pressed the button before Daniel could stop him. White flash tore through the forest. The creature's shadow jerked its head sharply to one side and disappeared. Immediately afterward, a deep roar rolled across the rock wall, vibrating through Daniel's chest. Small stones fell into the clearing, then larger ones struck the rock surface around them. Daniel pulled Susan close to the wall and ordered both of them to cover their heads. Mark still clutched the camera and said he had captured proof. Daniel ripped the roll of film out of the camera, and Mark lunged to keep it. As the 2 struggled, Susan shouted that something was running on the left. A huge shadow crossed the open ground so fast they saw only a strip of black fur. Daniel spotted an escape route to the north, but 2 large trees had been pulled down across it, blocking the path like a closed gate. Cold rain lashed all 3 pale faces. Daniel divided the watch shifts and ordered Mark to put the camera in his pack. When morning came, the footsteps around camp gradually withdrew. Daniel checked the ground and found footprints surrounding the rocky clearing. They came in 3 sizes. The largest was 18 inches long. Another group was around 14 inches, and smaller prints like children's feet lay near the brush. The presence of young ones made Daniel understand why the warnings had become more intense. He decided the group would turn south even if they had to abandon some gear and endure 2 more days of travel. Susan agreed while Mark stood still beside the camera, his eyes fixed on the opposite slope. He kept the film roll in his jacket pocket, wanting proof that the fear of the previous night meant something. As the group packed, a black shape appeared between 2 pines on the high slope. The creature revealed its head, shoulders, and broad chest in the morning light. Long enough for all 3 to understand it had shown itself deliberately. Mark stepped out of the clearing. Daniel called for him to come back, but Mark had already raised the camera and run up the root-covered slope. Susan shouted her husband's name. Daniel threw down his pack and rushed after him, because he knew Mark was heading straight toward the area with the small footprints. Mark crossed a rocky shoulder and stopped in a clearing where stones had been arranged into an arc. He saw a small footprint in the mud and bent down to adjust the lens. Daniel arrived and saw that the branches around it had been bent into a shelter-like cover. He shouted for Mark to leave the area. A roar exploded behind the stones, making Mark drop the lens cap. The creature stepped out, nearly 9 feet tall, its rain-wet fur dark brown and black, its chest wide, and its arms hanging past its knees. Its eyes focused on Mark. The creature charged on 2 legs so fast Daniel could not draw his gun in time. Mark backed away, tripped on a stone, but held the camera against his chest. The creature's arm swept sideways, striking Mark's shoulder and backpack. Mark was hurled down the slope and lay still on the wet leaves. Susan rushed toward her husband, but Daniel raised a hand to stop her. The Bigfoot turned its head and stepped down toward Mark's motionless body. Daniel drew his gun, but the distance between the creature, Mark and Susan, was too close. A bullet would be unlikely to stop that giant body, and one bad shot could turn the situation into disaster. Daniel shoved the gun back into the holster, snatched the aluminum pot from his pack, and struck it hard against a rock. The sound made the creature turn. He lit a flare, raised the red flame, and shouted to pull its eyes away from Mark. When Bigfoot turned toward him, Daniel backed in the opposite direction from Susan and began to run. The creature chased him, each footstep slamming down hard enough to shake the ground. Daniel raced through the pines, hearing branches break behind him. A rock flew past his shoulder and snapped a trunk ahead. Daniel changed direction, but after several minutes, he realized every obstacle was forcing him east. The creature was driving him toward a place it had already chosen. Daniel ran diagonally across the mountainside instead of moving in a straight line, because he understood the creature behind him was stronger than he was in speed and endurance. He chose narrow gaps between trees where its huge shoulders would have to shift, then changed rhythm to avoid being predicted. The footsteps striking the forest floor behind him grew closer, tossing wet leaves from the ground. Daniel held the flare in his right hand and used his left to push branches away from his face. When the distance closed, he ignited the flare, turned, and threw the red flame into a low patch of leaves. The sudden light made the creature stop, but the advantage lasted only a few seconds. Daniel kept running, hearing the deep roar roll through the trunks and feeling the ground tremble under his boots. A rock flew from behind, struck a large branch ahead, and broke it down across the path. Daniel had to turn east. He tried to shift direction up the northern slope, but Bigfoot appeared ahead of him, struck a tree trunk, and threw a smaller log across the way. Daniel turned back and realized every escape route was being blocked by intentional strength. The creature was controlling the direction of his flight. On a slick slope, Daniel slipped and fell, his shoulder hitting a root. He had barely pushed himself up when Bigfoot appeared on the high ground, close enough for him to see its amber eyes clearly through the rain. It could have reached him in a few steps, but it stopped, pulled a rock from the mud, and threw it to Daniel's left. The stone landed on the exact path he had intended to choose. Daniel understood the message and ran the other way. That thought turned his fear into a colder question. The creature had many chances to knock him down as it had done to Mark, but every throw had targeted trees, stones, or pathways. It wanted him to keep moving, not stay down. Daniel tried stopping behind an oak, turning toward the creature, and raising both hands to show he understood. Bigfoot took a few steps closer and slammed both hands against a nearby trunk, creating a sound heavy as a hammer. Daniel was forced to run again. After nearly half an hour, his breath burned, his knees ached, and the flare had nearly burned out. The forest ahead thinned, revealing gray stone under the rain. Daniel crossed a low ridge, hoping to find a way down into the valley. Instead, he stood before the edge of a deep ravine, white water, rushing between steep walls. Behind him, the footsteps slowed. Daniel looked down into the ravine, then turned back toward the dark figure approaching, understanding that the open path had led him to a place where there was nowhere left to run. Daniel stood close to the edge of the ravine, his eyes quickly scanning the narrow stream twisting between the two rock walls. Behind him, Bigfoot's footsteps slowed, each heavy beat echoing across the wet forest floor. He saw a small stone ledge along the wall, wide enough for one person to cling across if he kept his balance. Daniel removed his outer jacket, tied both sleeves around a long branch, and pulled the collar over the wood to shape it like a person crouching and running. He set the decoy beside the water's edge, then picked up the aluminum pot and threw it hard to the opposite side. The sound of metal striking stone rang through the ravine. Bigfoot turned its head toward the noise, while Daniel pushed the branch wearing his jacket into the water. The current carried the false human shape past the rocks, making the cloth rise and sink like a body trying to escape. Daniel used the moment to slide down onto the narrow ledge, gripping roots and pressing his back against the cold rock face. A pebble slipped from under his boot and fell into the water, but the creek swallowed the sound. From his lower position, he saw the creature's shadow appear at the ravine edge. It watched the drifting jacket, tilted its head for a moment, and moved in the direction of the current. Daniel waited several more minutes, breathing evenly, though his arms were beginning to tremble from cold and strain. When the footsteps faded, he climbed back up the northern slope and moved quickly through a strip of low forest. Nearly 20 minutes passed, and the forest behind him remained quiet. Daniel thought the plan had worked. He stopped beside a small stream, checked his torn elbow, swollen knee, and flare pouch. He had only one flare left. After drinking a few mouthfuls of water, Daniel opened the map and estimated a loop back to Mark and Susan. A brief feeling of relief appeared, like the moment when a person believes the worst danger has passed. As he bent to fold the map, Daniel saw a large footprint in the mud right beside his knee. Water had not yet spilled into the edge of the print, proving it had just been made. He lifted his head, and a deep breath sounded from above the rock ledge. His jacket suddenly dropped in front of him, soaked and covered in rotting leaves. Bigfoot stood above, looking at him with eyes so calm they chilled him. The creature had recognized the decoy, circled the mountainside, and waited at the place where Daniel had to stop for water. Daniel understood that he was facing an intelligence capable of observing, remembering, and responding to tricks. Bigfoot turned its head east, released a short roar, then stepped aside, leaving exactly one open direction. Cold rain ran down Daniel's neck and soaked into his shirt. He picked up the jacket, put it back on, and continued along the path the creature had chosen. Daniel continued east with an exhausted body, but the sound behind him kept a steady distance. Each time he slowed, a single knock rang through the forest, like a reminder that the road had been chosen for him. After nearly an hour, Daniel saw a piece of yellow fabric caught on a low branch at the foot of a cliff. The color immediately reminded him of Walter Briggs's raincoat. He left the path, moved through wet leaves, and found a small camp abandoned in a hurry. The yellow tarp had come loose from its lines, a metal cup lay tilted. Beside cold ash and an open film canister showed several used rolls. Daniel called Walter's name twice. The answer came only from water, dripping through rock cracks and a distant knock deeper in the forest. He searched the belongings and found an oilcloth-wrapped notebook under the pack. The first pages recorded footprints, weather, and places where knocks had been heard. Toward the end, the handwriting grew more hurried. Walter wrote that he had tracked a group of at least 5 individuals, including 2 young ones. He believed they moved seasonally between 2 hidden valleys and were protecting a breeding area. One line had been underlined many times. Do not use flash. Do not cross the tree ring. Do not follow the young. On the next page, Walter wrote that he had seen a creature carry the young woman's handkerchief up the mountainside. Daniel understood that Walter had been observing Mark and Susan from close range, perhaps even before their meeting at the shelter. In a notebook pocket was an old photograph of a young man beside a truck, with Thomas Briggs and the year 1961 written on the back. Daniel recognized him as the missing brother, the reason Walter had spent 17 years wandering these mountains. He searched around the camp and found Walter's boot prints leading toward a strange structure behind ferns. Several young trees had been bent, their tops woven into a wide ring, large enough for a person to step through. Beyond the tree ring were many large footprints in the soft soil, with several smaller ones mixed between them. Daniel stopped before that boundary. He called Walter again, his voice carrying into the darkness beneath the cliff. A low groan answered from the far side, sounding almost like a person in pain. Daniel placed his hand on the gun, but the memory of Walter's warning kept him in place. He considered crossing through to find Walter, while also remembering that Mark and Susan were still behind him and might need him to return. The groan sounded again, longer this time, then was cut off by a heavy knock. Daniel looked at the tree ring before him and understood that every choice now could lead someone deeper into the place they had been told to avoid. Daniel stood in front of the tree ring for a long time, then decided to follow the boundary edge to find a way around instead of stepping straight through. Heavy rain suddenly poured down, softening the soil under his feet and making the roots slick as if covered in oil. When Daniel grabbed a low trunk to cross the slope, the ground beneath him collapsed. He slid through wet leaves, slammed his shoulder into 2 rocks, and fell into a natural basin deep between the cliffs. Daniel needed several seconds to recover his breath. When he stood, he realized this place was completely different from the forest above. The hidden valley lay between high rock walls, its tree canopy so thick that light entered only in thin strips. Across the soft ground were countless footprints in many sizes, from prints nearly 18 inches long to small ones like children's feet. The trees around him carried patches of bark stripped at several heights. Some large branches had been woven into low roofs beneath rock overhangs, covered in moss and dry leaves, like temporary shelters used for a long time. Daniel stood still, trying to steady his breathing and listen. A slight movement appeared near the eastern wall. A female Bigfoot stepped from the tree shadows, large-bodied but softer in shape than the male that had chased him. She kept a young one tight against her side, her long hand resting on the small creature's shoulder the way a mother holds a child away from a stranger. Nearby, two large shadows rose behind the brush. Daniel felt every previous detail fitting into one answer. Susan's handkerchief had been taken because it held the scent of strangers. The X-shaped branches marked limits. The stones before the tent were warnings. Mark's flash had lit the area of the young ones, making the adult react like a family protector. Heavy footsteps sounded on the slope behind him. The massive male appeared at the place where Daniel had slid down, blocking the way back up with a body nearly as wide as the gap between two trunks. It came down a few steps, making a low sound, while the other individuals looked toward Daniel. A young one, curious, left the shelter and took a step toward him. The male Bigfoot immediately moved in front of it, widening its shoulders and lowering its arms. Daniel understood he was standing in the center of a family group, right in the place they had been trying to protect from the beginning. He slowly drew his gun from the holster with 2 fingers, placed it in the mud, and raised both open hands before his chest. The male Bigfoot stopped about 20 feet from him. Its amber eyes moved from Daniel's face down to the gun. The creature stepped forward, used one foot to push the weapon, sliding far away through the wet leaves, then lifted its head and looked directly at him. Daniel understood clearly that his chance to leave the valley now depended on whether he understood the boundary being set before him. Daniel kept both hands open in front of his chest and stepped away from the gun lying in the mud. He avoided staring too long at the young one, because focused eye contact could be understood as attention given to a target. The male Bigfoot came a few steps closer, stopping at a distance where Daniel could clearly see its face. Its low brow was covered in dark fur, its nose broad, its eyes amber, and a scar ran across its cheek, creating the weathered look of a creature that had protected this place through many winters. Its breath carried the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves, while its large chest moved slowly with each rhythm. Daniel felt that the gun near his feet had become meaningless before that strength. He took the camera from his coat pocket, placed it beside the weapon, and used the toe of his boot to push both farther away. Bigfoot looked at the camera longer than the gun. Its eyes stopped on the flash, as if that device was tied to the moment Mark had invaded the young one's area. Daniel pointed to the slope where he had fallen, then pointed in the opposite direction and stepped back again. He wanted the creature to understand that he was looking for a way to leave. Low sounds rose from the individuals standing around the valley. They carried broken rhythms, like a conversation in a register Daniel had never heard. The young one beside the female Bigfoot bent down and picked up a small stone. It lifted the stone to study it, but the female gently took it from its hand and pulled it back behind her. That gesture made Daniel realize the beings in front of him were caring for, teaching and protecting their young in a way very close to humans. The male Bigfoot watched him for another moment, then shifted left. A narrow path between 2 rock walls appeared behind its huge body. Daniel understood this was conditional permission. He was allowed to leave, but every step into the sheltering ground had ended. Daniel slowly bent down, took the first aid kit and water bottle from his pack, and left the gun and camera lying in the mud, accepting the trade of proof and property for a chance to return. When he began climbing the narrow slope, the male Bigfoot followed at an even distance. Its presence made Daniel understand he was being escorted out of the territory, and one wrong decision could still change everything. At the edge of the valley, he turned back one last time. The male stood before the young one hand resting on a tree trunk like a living gate. Daniel bowed his head slightly and continued. The chase he had just survived now appeared in a different meaning. If the creature had wanted to kill him, it had many chances along the way. Its power had been used to force him to leave, keep distance, and protect family. Daniel had just found the mountainside leading back to the trail when 3 gunshots rang out in the distance. The sound tore through the valley, causing deep calls to rise behind him. Daniel turned toward Mark and Susan, understanding that the fragile peace that had just been established might already have been broken. It took Daniel nearly 3 hours to make his way back across the rocky slopes to the place where Mark had been thrown. The rain had lightened, but thick mud made every step costly. When he reached the old area, he found Susan sitting under a fallen trunk, both hands clutching her husband's small gun. Her face had gone pale from cold and worry. As soon as she saw Daniel, Susan jumped to her feet and asked where Mark was. Daniel realized she was waiting for an answer from him too. Susan said Mark had woken about 20 minutes after the fall. His right shoulder was swollen, his lip split, and his steps unsteady, but he insisted. Daniel had been dragged deep into the forest by the creature. Susan wanted them to retreat south according to Daniel's last instruction. Mark argued that the man who had just saved him was in danger and had to be found before dark. He took the gun, told Susan to stay, and went east nearly an hour earlier. The 3 shots Daniel had heard came after that. Susan did not know whether Mark had fired to signal or aimed at something in the forest. Daniel bent down and checked the area. Mark's boot prints were clear in the mud, running in the same direction as the hidden valley. He felt anger rise, but that frustration quickly gave way to fear. Mark had seen the small footprints, had been warned, and had still carried a weapon back into the living area of an entire Bigfoot group. Daniel told Susan to stay while he searched, but she immediately shook her head. She said Mark would keep acting recklessly if he met only Daniel, while her presence might make him stop. Daniel looked at her shoulders, trembling from cold, and gave her the extra raincoat from his pack. He had not yet told her about the valley, the young ones, or the fact that he had left his gun and camera behind. However, Susan looked at the empty holster on his hip and understood something major had happened. Daniel only said the eastern area was a place they absolutely had to avoid, because every sign since the beginning of the trip had led to a boundary Mark had just crossed again. The 2 followed the boot prints through the forest. Near a large pine, Daniel picked up a fresh brass casing beneath the wet leaves. A few feet away, a strip of dark brown and black fur clung to bark with a dark smear spreading beneath it in the rainwater. Daniel looked toward where the footprints continued and understood that Mark may have shot the creature protecting the valley at close range. Daniel and Susan followed the boot prints for nearly half a mile before finding Mark sitting against a tree, his face bloodless and his right arm clutched tightly against his injured shoulder. The gun lay on the ground near his feet, the barrel still smelling of powder. Susan knelt to check her husband while Daniel examined the area. Mark said a large shadow had appeared in front of him, blocked the way, and moved toward him. He fired the first shot into the air as a warning. When the creature kept stepping forward, he pulled the trigger 2 more times. Mark did not know whether a bullet had hit the target, because the rain blurred his sight and the dark shape disappeared after the final shot. Daniel moved to where Mark had stood. 1 bullet was buried in a tree trunk, the second had chipped a rock. Near a fern patch he found several strands of dark brown and black fur on the leaves, along with a dark liquid slowly thinning in the rainwater. A large footprint changed direction sharply there, showing that at least 1 bullet had grazed the creature's body. Mark insisted he had only defended himself, but Daniel reminded him that Bigfoot had already had the chance to kill him on the slope. The earlier strike had been meant to push him away from the young ones, while the 3 shots just now had turned a warning into a real wound. Daniel briefly explained that to the east was a hidden valley where many adults lived with young ones. Susan believed him, as soon as she heard about the small footprints around the rocky clearing. Mark said Daniel had suffered a shock after the chase and was explaining everything through a story too impossible to believe. Anger showed clearly on Susan's face. She snatched the gun from the ground and handed it to Daniel, saying Mark had lost the right to decide from the moment he hid the true purpose of the trip and chased the creature with a camera. Mark tried to stand to take back the weapon, but pain in his shoulder forced him down. Daniel removed the magazine, checked the chamber, and placed the parts in 2 different pockets. A long howl suddenly rose from deep in the forest. A few seconds later, lower sounds answered from the northern slope. Then another came from behind them. Daniel understood that the communication pattern had changed. The earlier knocks had been used to warn and guide, but this sequence sounded like a summons. He told Susan to help Mark stand and prepare to leave the area immediately. When Daniel lifted his head, 3 large figures were already standing on the path behind them, between the tree trunks, broad-shouldered and motionless in the rain, like a living wall closing around. All 3 on the route back. Daniel led Susan and Mark away from the patch of forest before the 3 large shadows could close the path. He chose a northwest route where the map marked a wooden bridge crossing a creek before connecting with a ranger patrol road. Susan draped Mark's uninjured arm over her shoulder while Daniel walked behind to watch the movements between the trees. The Bigfoot individuals did not close in immediately. They moved parallel to them along the slope, keeping just enough distance to appear and vanish through the rain. Daniel recognized the familiar pattern of enclosure. They were pushing the group away from the core area, but the safest route on the map ran close to the young one's territory. He changed direction to lower ground, following the creek to avoid passing near the valley. Rainwater rose quickly, carrying leaves and rotting branches into the rocks. Mark's steps grew heavier, his breathing short, his face tightening each time his right shoulder moved with his stride. When they reached the bridge, several boards in the middle had been washed away. Susan crossed first by gripping the handrail ropes and placing her feet on the remaining solid boards. Daniel held Mark's backpack strap and guided him to crawl, section by section, across the slick bridge. They had just reached the middle when a roar sounded from the bank behind them. Mark turned his head too quickly, and his foot slipped off the plank. His weight ripped another board loose, sending half his body down through the gap. Daniel dropped to his knees and gripped the backpack strap with both hands, while Susan crawled back to grab her husband's wrist. On the bank, a male Bigfoot appeared among the brush. Its left shoulder showed a dark patch of matted fur from the bullet wound. The creature moved toward the bridge edge, its eyes fixed on Mark. In panic, Mark reached toward the unloaded gun tucked into Daniel's outer pocket. That movement made Bigfoot accelerate again. Daniel cut Mark's pack strap cleanly, shoved him toward Susan, and stood blocking the middle of the bridge. Bigfoot stopped at the wooden span, slammed one hand down against a support post. The whole bridge shook, and old nails popped from the edges of the boards. Daniel understood. The structure was about to collapse. He signaled for Susan to pull Mark to the opposite bank, then climbed over the rail and jumped into the shallow water below. The cold water struck his legs, but he kept his balance, waded over the rocks, and climbed up the other side. Bigfoot stayed on the old bank, avoiding the collapsing bridge section. Just as all 3 escaped the creek, a deep cracking sound came from the slope ahead. Soil, rocks, and small trees slid down, burying the route toward the ranger road. Daniel stared at the newly formed wall of mud and understood that their retreat plan had failed before they could leave the enclosed area. The 3 had to find shelter before darkness covered the mountainside. Daniel found a shallow rock hollow above the creek, wide enough for them to sit close together and avoid most of the rain. The wood around them was soaked, and the wind blowing through the rock crack made every attempt to start a fire fail. Susan helped Mark lean against the wall, then removed her outer coat to cushion his injured arm. Daniel checked the swollen shoulder and realized the collarbone might be cracked, but had not caused worse damage. Mark had a mild fever, dry lips, and breathing that grew heavier with each hour. In the cramped darkness, the silence between husband and wife became more tense than the rain. Susan asked why Mark had hidden the handkerchief, the purpose of taking pictures, and the decision to bring her into a dangerous area. Mark first said he only wanted to preserve the memory of a meaningful trip. When Susan looked straight at him, that excuse quickly lost its weight. Mark admitted he had sent a photo proposal to an outdoor magazine weeks earlier. He believed a photograph of an unconfirmed creature could help him escape small freelance photography jobs and finally be taken seriously. Susan went silent as she realized their anniversary trip had actually been turned into a career opportunity. Daniel sat near the mouth of the hollow, listening to movement in the forest, then said curiosity was not the greatest mistake. The mistake began when a person recognized a warning and kept going because he believed his own goal mattered more than the boundary before him. Mark lowered his head, his uninjured hand tightening around his knee. A heavy footstep sounded outside in the rain, then stopped near the hollow entrance. Several minutes passed before a large stone was placed on the ground. Daniel recognized the familiar shape in the dim light. A second stone appeared afterward, aligned with the first. He understood the third would complete the final warning. Daniel began dividing items from Mark's pack, preparing to move the group before dawn, even though Mark's body was not ready. Susan asked what would happen if they stayed. Outside, sounds continued, circling the rock, hollow, slow, and patient, making her question sound like a confession that all three had run out of choices. Daniel only replied that every ignored warning had been followed by a stronger one. During the night, Mark woke, took the film roll from his pocket, and handed it to Daniel. He asked Daniel to bring it out if he could not keep going. Daniel looked at the roll, placed it on the stone floor, and said that small thing had made Mark forget when to stop. Near dawn, the rain slowed. A large hand appeared outside the hollow entrance, gently placed the third stone in the row, then withdrew into the darkness. Daniel laid out the plan when morning light entered the rock hollow. Susan would help Mark follow the ravine west, while Daniel would carry the film roll, the unloaded gun, and Mark's jacket to draw attention in the opposite direction. Susan objected because Daniel had already made himself a target once and nearly died. He explained that the smell of gunpowder, metal, and photography equipment was drawing the Bigfoot group's focus to them. Mark wanted to take that danger himself, but his injured arm made him collapse as soon as he tried to brace himself on the ground. Daniel said this was not a display of bravery. It was a way to correct the damage they had all created. He put the film roll in his coat pocket, took the final flare, and stepped out of the hollow. In the forest, the three stones still lay in a row under the rain. Daniel walked back toward the high slope, striking the aluminum pot against tree trunks to make a sound that carried far. Heavy footsteps appeared behind him immediately. A large shadow moved between the pines, and then the wounded male stepped into the trail. The fur on its left shoulder was dark and matted close to the body, while its amber eyes locked on Daniel. He raised the flare, kept backing east, and dragged Mark's jacket through the brush to keep the smell of gunpowder in the direction he had chosen. Bigfoot accelerated, broke young trees, and threw them across the escape path. Daniel changed direction along the rock wall, hearing the roar strike his chest like the pressure of a storm. He realized the creature was trying to force him back toward the ravine where Susan and Mark were moving. Daniel struck the pot harder, shouted, and threw the empty gun down the rocky slope to pull its attention back to him. The trick worked for a few seconds. Bigfoot turned its head, but immediately turned back when Daniel kept running. A rock tore through the rain and shattered a tree trunk beside his head. Daniel plunged into the mud, slid close to the cliff edge, and caught himself with his hands before the landslide took his body down with it. When he turned back, he saw Bigfoot standing less than 20 feet away. The creature looked at him, then looked toward the valley behind it. That moment helped Daniel understand that the anger in front of him was tied to a deeper fear. Humans had come too close to its family and were carrying proof that could lead more people back. Daniel took the film roll from his pocket and held it at eye level for the creature to see. He dropped it into the mud, put his heel on the canister, and crushed it until the plastic casing broke apart. Bigfoot stopped. It came closer, bent down, picked up the twisted canister, and held it in its wide hand. Daniel stood at the cliff edge with both hands open, letting rain run down his face. From far away, Susan's voice rose, calling Mark's name in panic. Bigfoot lifted its head, snapped toward the sound, and charged through the forest. Daniel ran after it at once, because he understood that the sacrifice he had just made was still not enough to keep the other two safe. Daniel ran after Bigfoot through the forest, where Susan's voice still echoed through the thick rain. When he crossed a muddy slope, he saw Mark trapped in a collapsed patch of ground. Half his body hung below the edge, while Susan lay flat on the stone, gripping her husband's backpack strap with both hands. Each time more soil slipped, Mark's body slid down a few inches. Bigfoot stopped about 20 feet from them. Susan looked up in panic, pulled out the unloaded gun, and aimed it at the creature. Daniel stepped between them, raised both hands, and told her to put the weapon down. Susan shook so badly, the barrel swung back and forth, because she did not know Daniel had removed all the ammunition earlier. Bigfoot came one step closer, its eyes moving from the gun to Mark trapped below. Daniel held his position, then slowly turned toward the collapsed ground. He pointed down at Mark, took hold of the strap, and tried pulling to show the creature that the man below was in danger. Bigfoot made a deep sound in its chest. Susan backed away, still holding the gun in both hands. Daniel reminded her to place it on the ground. After a few seconds of hesitation, Susan obeyed and crawled back to the edge to hold the strap. Bigfoot came forward. Its huge body nearly filled the narrow space beside the collapsed ground. Daniel stepped aside, even though every instinct in him told him to get away. The creature bent down, grabbed the backpack strap with one hand, and lifted Mark out of the hole as easily as picking up an empty sack. Susan wrapped her arms around her husband and pulled him away from the cracking edge. Mark looked up at Bigfoot, his face pale with pain and shame. The creature stood upright and looked for a long time at the man who had shot it. The wound on its left shoulder was still dark in the rain, but it did not turn its anger toward Mark. It turned to the gun on the ground, picked it up, and closed both hands around the frame. The metal bent with a dry cracking sound that left all three humans silent. Bigfoot threw the gun into the hole, where it struck rock and vanished into darkness. Then the creature stepped east and blocked the path leading back to the valley. Daniel understood the act more clearly than words. Saving Mark was not forgiveness. It was the fastest way to force the group to leave this place. Bigfoot turned west, struck one hand against a tree trunk, and looked back. Daniel helped Mark stand and gave his uninjured arm to Susan. All three began walking in the direction the creature had opened. Because the only choice left for survival was to accept the road it had chosen. Bigfoot walked 20 paces ahead, occasionally stopping to look back and make sure all three were still following the path it had chosen. Daniel supported Mark's good shoulder, while Susan wrapped an arm around her husband's back to keep him upright on the slick ground. They moved between two narrow rock walls, where exposed roots rose like natural steps. This route did not appear on Daniel's map, but it led them away from the valley and the landslide slopes. Along both sides of the path, large shadows appeared between the trees. One individual stood on a rock outcrop, another watched from low pine brush, and smaller shapes stayed hidden deeper behind them. They kept a steady distance, forming a living corridor that forced the humans to keep moving west. Mark kept his head down, breathing heavily through pain, but even he realized the creatures were escorting them instead of hunting them. Susan tightened her grip around her husband's waist. Each time a dark shape moved closer. Daniel kept his pace slow, avoided sudden movement, and did not reach toward his pockets. After nearly an hour, the lead Bigfoot brought them to a large ring of bent trees over the trail. The young trunks had been woven into an arch high enough for the giant creature to pass through. It stopped inside the boundary and turned to look at Daniel. He understood. This was the end of the territory they had invaded. Daniel helped Mark pass through. First Susan, following close behind, and he was the last to leave the tree ring. When Daniel's foot touched the other side, a knock sounded behind him. Two others answered from deep in the forest, spreading across the slopes like a signal that the strangers were out. The lead Bigfoot still stood across the boundary, its injured shoulder slightly lowered, but its eyes sharp. Daniel turned back and bowed his head lightly to show that he understood. The creature watched him for a while, then placed one stone on a tree stump beside the trail. A single stone meant something different from the 3 stones before the tent. But Daniel did not know whether it was an ending sign, a reminder, or the creature's way of remembering a man who had once been spared. Bigfoot turned away, stepped toward the valley, and gradually disappeared between the trunks. From far away came the high call of a young one. The adult's deep sound answered right afterward. When the last shadows withdrew from the mountainside, birdsong began returning to the branches. Daniel stood listening for a few seconds, then helped Mark keep walking. The forest ahead was cold, wet, and long, but for the first time in many days, the road no longer felt as if it were closing around them. The next 2 days became a slow journey through the wet forest, where every mile required all 3 people to share what little strength remained. Mark could not walk more than a few hundred yards on his own. Daniel cut a straight branch, used strips of cloth to secure Mark's right shoulder, then took turns with Susan, supporting the left side of his body. They left most of their gear behind to reduce weight, keeping only water, dried food, the first aid kit, and the rain-blurred map. Daniel chose gentler slopes, avoided deep ravines, and stopped whenever Mark began breathing too hard. The remaining food was divided into small pieces, just enough to keep their minds clear and their legs moving. Each time they crossed a stream, Daniel gathered water from the strongest current, used purification tablets, and waited before giving it to the other 2. During the first day, Mark repeatedly asked Daniel what he had seen in the valley. Daniel said there were adults, young ones, and shelters built under rock walls. He kept the exact location to himself, because after everything that had happened, he understood that a story told to the wrong person could bring more search parties. Mark lowered his head and admitted that at first he only wanted to prove he had seen something unusual. After realizing the photograph could change his career, the desire to be recognized had drowned out every warning. Susan cared for her husband's wound, but the familiar tenderness had vanished from each gesture. She gave him water, adjusted the brace, and helped him stand like someone carrying out a necessary responsibility. Mark tried to apologize, but Susan said they should save their strength for getting out of the forest. Daniel heard the fracture in that answer and understood some wounds would last longer than cracked bone. On the final night, they made camp near the Ranger Road. The forest had regained the sounds of birds, water, and squirrels running along branches, but Daniel still startled each time a branch snapped in the dark. The next morning, he saw 3 small stones beside their sleeping place. Daniel's shoulders instantly tightened, Susan admitted she had placed them there to remind the group to remember what had happened. Daniel bent down, separated each stone, and placed them in 3 different spots. He said that warning belonged to the forest and should not be turned into a souvenir. By midday, the roof of the ranger station appeared behind the trees. Mark began to cry at the first sign of human presence. Daniel turned back toward the forest and listened for a few seconds. Behind them, there was only wind moving through leaves, but he still had the feeling of calm eyes watching until all 3 had fully stepped off the trail. The rangers saw the 3 from a distance and ran out to help Mark inside the station. His right arm had almost lost the ability to move. His lips were dry, his clothes were covered in mud, and his face had gone gray from exhaustion. An ambulance was called from the nearest town, while Daniel and Susan sat in the small duty room and described what had happened. Daniel described a creature nearly 9 feet tall, 5-toed footprints, knocks transmitting across the slopes, stones placed before the tent, and a hidden valley with many individuals and young ones. The ranger took careful notes, but each time Daniel mentioned Bigfoot, he changed the wording to a large bear or an unidentified animal. Daniel explained that bears do not arrange stones in rows, throw objects precisely to block paths, or guide strangers out of their territory along a chosen route. The ranger looked toward Susan as if hoping for a simpler account. She confirmed the knocks, the stones, the giant shadows, and the moment Mark was struck off the slope, but admitted she had not clearly seen the creature's face in the rain. At the hospital, doctors diagnosed Mark with a cracked collarbone, mild concussion, dehydration, and multiple bruises. When a local police officer asked whether he had been drinking or using drugs before the trip, Mark began to hesitate. He feared that a story about a legendary creature would make people treat him like a liar and ruin what remained of his photography work. In the end, Mark said a large animal had attacked him, but he was not sure what kind. That hesitation made the 3 statements inconsistent. Daniel wanted to lead a search team to the place where he had left the camera, gun, and crushed film roll, but bad weather kept the slopes sliding. The official report was completed with the conclusion that Mark had suffered a bear-related accident in heavy rain, while the other phenomena came from panic and exhaustion. Daniel objected, but he no longer had clear physical evidence to change the document. He asked about Walter Briggs and learned that an older man in a yellow raincoat had registered to enter the area earlier but had never reported leaving the trail. A search team went out after the weather stabilized. They found no Walter, no abandoned camp, and no valley Daniel had roughly marked on the map. The searchers said the area was only cliffs and dense forest with no safe way down. 1 week later, Daniel received an envelope with no return address. Inside was the old photograph of Thomas Briggs and a note saying Walter had gone to find his brother one last time, and this time he no longer intended to return from those mountains again. Many years after the 1978 trip, Daniel Harper refused to appear on television or join any Bigfoot hunting programs. He only told the story to a few independent researchers and always asked them to conceal the location of Laurel Gap. He kept his notebook and old map in a drawer, but the valley was marked only by a wide circle. Mark and Susan tried to return to normal life, but the distance formed. In the forest followed them home. They separated about 2 years later. Susan once wrote to Daniel that what hurt her most was Mark placing personal ambition above the warnings and his wife's safety. Mark left nature photography, sold most of his equipment, and went to work in a print shop. Daniel believed crushing the film roll had been the right decision. Walter Briggs' file remained closed with the words missing person. Some believed he had slipped into a ravine, while Daniel believed Walter had crossed the boundary because he wanted an answer about Thomas. Daniel never described those creatures as gentle giants. He always emphasized their strength, speed, and ability to cause injury when family or territory was threatened. What he objected to was the way the official record turned the incident into an unprovoked attack. Before Mark was knocked down, the group had received a long series of warnings. Knocks from several directions, rocks thrown onto paths, branches arranged in X shapes, 3 stones before a shelter, and blocked trails. Each sign had given them a chance to turn back. Years passed, and Daniel sometimes returned to the outer edges of the area, but he never crossed Laurel Gap again. On one trip in the early 1990s, he saw a single stone placed on a stump beside the trail. Daniel stood before it for a long time, then quietly left. He did not know whether it was coincidence, a sign of recognition, or a reminder that the beings in the valley still remembered the man who had once lowered his weapon before them. The scars on his knee and elbow stayed with him for the rest of his life. But the memory that haunted Daniel most was the moment Bigfoot pulled Mark from the collapsed ground. The creature had every reason to leave the man who had shot it behind, but it still saved him so the group could leave its territory. Daniel believed intelligence is not only found in language or tools. Intelligence also appears in the ability to warn, restrain strength, and give an opponent the chance to correct a mistake. When he grew old, Daniel often sat before the frayed Appalachian map, placing his finger near Laurel Gap but never touching the valley's location. For him, the important question was no longer whether Bigfoot existed. The more frightening question was how many times humans had crossed a boundary they were too arrogant to recognize. Nature does not always need to be conquered. Sometimes survival begins at the moment a person understands he has gone too far and becomes humble enough to turn back.